Namaste and welcome. This is Divyanshi Sharda, your host. The guest joining us for today's show is Shri Vishal Ganesan ji. Vishal Ganesan ji is an attorney, media commentator, and the curator of the Hindu History Project, which is dedicated to understanding how Americans conceived of the Hindu in the 19th and the 20th centuries. By focusing primarily on newspaper clippings, Hindu history aims to describe and contextualize how the average American's attitudes towards the Hindu formed and changed over time. Hindu history is a multimedia project that exists on multiple digital platforms, including Twitter, Instagram, and Substack. In addition to his archival research, Vishal has also discussed his work on podcasts such as Bharat Varta, Indus Think, and My Ind Makers. Vishalji, namaste and welcome to the show.
Namaste. Thank you for having me.
So, Vishalji, you've done some remarkable research on the history of Hindus in America, and you've even published it under, as we've already mentioned it, the title of "quote unquote" Hindu history with a very unique phrasing, if we were to note. Could you please tell us about this research of yours and what made you get drawn to it?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a guest on this podcast, and yeah, thank you. So it started. It was very happenstance. I come across the Library of Congress here in America. They have a very extensive digital newspaper archive, and everything is digitized and searchable. And I had come across this archive. I don't remember how I kind of stumbled across it, and it was just kind of a curiosity for me. I'd go on the database and I'd kind of look through old newspapers and just find, items that were just curious items. And then I think I was just like browsing and I came across an ad in one of these newspapers for a Hindu magician, right? It was like Hindoo magician. It was like an ad for an exhibit. I was like, what is going on here? Like, I was just kind of taken aback. I was like, especially that early, like early 19th century. So I saw this ad and I started wondering, like, okay, well, what's going on here? So I kind of started searching specifically for things about like Hindu magic or Hindu wizardry. And I realized that there's a whole genre in the 19th and 20th centuries of, American magicians traveling the country claiming to have access to Hindu magic they learned from fakirs or swamis in India. And so this kind of sent me down a rabbit hole where I started kind of searching more specifically to try and understand what was going on. And I started collecting all these clips. And my thought from the beginning was like, if you're trying to kind of get a view into what early attitudes are or what like the average American thought, newspapers are a good way to get to that, right? Because newspapers were so prolific. There were so many of them. They were published locally, they were published regionally, they were published nationally. A lot of these newspapers even published multiple times a day. So you had this kind of ongoing narrative and dialogue with the audience that I felt was very insightful for me, just to kind of get a sense of what people were saying and thinking. So, I started collecting all these newspaper clips and they were very interesting to me. And then, I kind of started doing more research. I started looking at secondary scholarly sources. And, one of the books that I rely on quite heavily is this book called Heathen, Hindu by Michael Altman. I cite it extensively in my Instagram and my Twitter posts and on the Substack as well. But, that book really kind of gave me the intellectual scaffolding, I would say. So, I had all these random newspaper clips, and then I kind of, thanks to Dr. Altman, had this intellectual framework, and now it's, just a matter of kind of, finding this evidence and plugging into this narrative that I've tried to build out. But yeah, it's been a very interesting project so far.
So, as you say, your main source for the data was newspaper clippings and also this book called Heathen Hindus. So what was this book written during that period of time itself, or was it a new publication with the perspective of how things were back in the day in the 19th, 20th century?
Yeah, the book was written recently. I don't remember the date. I don't want to give you the wrong date, but it was written like, I think within the last decade, maybe. It's a new, he works at the University of Alabama. He's in the religion department there. So it's a relatively recent book, but I think, the methodological distinction that he makes, and this is, kind of related to your question of why I use Hindu with the two O's. I mean, this is still the most common question I get. And the point is, some people like find it offensive. I'll sometimes get replies on my Twitter that say like, why are you spelling it like this? But, the point I'm trying to make is that, in this time period of American history, it's not like Hindus were in America in any significant numbers. I mean, there were probably scattered populations. brought here, in some sort of indentured servitude or whatever, or even like, isolated pockets of tradespeople, but that we weren't part of the cultural imagination as, Indians or Hindus in America. So a lot of the material that was read, that was distributed, propagated in America at this time, it was furthering certain representations of what was fundamentally a construct, right? Like the Hindu with the two O's is a construct. And, that was kind of unmoored from the reality of actual Indian life and actual Hinduism. So that's the distinction I was trying to draw. And, Dr. Altman makes a really incisive point, I think, in his introduction. And I've tried to stay true to this methodology, which is that what these newspaper clips really tell us is not about Hindus in India or about India itself. They tell us about how Hindus were conceived of in America. And, and when you switch the emphasis in that way, it kind of changes your approach, because all of a sudden this becomes an American story, right? Like what was going on in American intellectual and cultural history that made them look at Hindus in this way? What role did the Hindu as a construct play in all these different sociological and theological disputes that were going on in America at the time? So that's kind of that's what Hindu history is focusing on, I think.
So if you were to give certain instances of the various newspaper clippings and the various projections of the Hindu community you have read about in the research that you've done, what would they be? What were the certain examples that you could tell our viewers about?
Yeah, so I think one of the sort of themes I've, now that I started in the early or late 18th century, I'm now kind of in the early mid 20th century. And I think one of the framework I've started to use, and I think it accurately captures, what I've seen for sure, is I would say that there are three main threads, three main narrative threads, right? And these are all kind of reflective of certain, I would say, interest groups and different cultural trends in America. So chronologically, the first kind of relationship that America had with India was really a commercial relationship. So, American traders were running merchant ships between New England and India in the 18th century, early 19th century, and it was a pretty fruitful relationship. There was this East India Marine Society in Massachusetts. It was like a guild hall for merchants who were running these trade routes, and they would bring back like textiles. They would bring back all sorts of fine goods from India, and they were super popular. And these merchants, they actually operated through intermediaries in India. So they would go to Calcutta, and they didn't have their own trading house there. So what they would have to do is they'd have to build relationships with the native traders in India, and these traders would help them act as intermediaries with markets and all this. And so American merchants developed very fruitful, very respectful relationships with merchants in India, with the merchant class. And, there's a lot of really interesting correspondence and evidence we see from this period that there was no religious angle to this interaction at all. In fact, a lot of these early merchants were kind of, and this was true of the early East India Company too, right? Like they weren't really interested in evangelization or kind of spreading Christianity, because their focus was the commercial relationship, and they didn't really see the Indians they were trading with as religiously backwards or pagan or anything like that. So you had this commercial relationship, but what happens is that in 1812, I think, you see the formation of this American Board of Foreign Missionaries. And this is an organization that kind of acts as a coordinating group for missionary trips into India. And you start seeing a lot more missionary literature that gets propagated, from missionaries who are working in India. One of the characters I focus on extensively is an individual named Claudius Buchanan. He was a very prominent figure in this story. He was an Anglican missionary, and he was operated in India for years. And he was famous for popularizing the Juggernaut, right? Juggernaut was the anglicized, rendition of the Jagannath Yatra. And this became, the kind of dominant image in the American cultural imagination for over 100 years, right? He, Michael Altman, or Dr. Altman writes about it in his book, and you see it in the newspapers too, is that the Jagannath was written as if it was straight out of the Old Testament. It's the seat of Moloch, it's literally this is the devil worship. And so, he wrote these very vivid descriptions of these Hindu religious festivals, and they really struck a nerve with American audiences who were so steeped in biblical lore and biblical literature. And there's a distinctive turn there, right? So you kind of have this commercial thread that was really based on this sort of mutually beneficial relationship of commercial transaction. And then this becomes overwhelmed by this sort of Claudius Buchanan missionary thread, which is very much kind of grounded into this idea that like these are the pagan Hindus and we have to save them through evangelical activity. And one of the mechanisms that this worked by is Buchanan and others. There's a very rich body of missionary journals, right? So you'd have missionaries in India who would write accounts of what they were doing, their work, whatever, various like anthropological observations, and they published these in missionary journals. And then the articles would subsequently get republished in newspapers, in New England especially. And so you had this propagation of these kind of this missionary narrative, and it I would say that kind of became the dominant narrative. And so those are the two kind of first the two major threads. And I think the third thread is the kind of elite reception, right? So the Asiatic Society was founded in Bengal in 1784. I always forget the exact date. I think it was 1784. So William Jones is there in Bengal, and he starts translating these Sanskrit texts. And he obviously had his own motivations. Like a lot of the motivation behind this translation project was, they were trying to rule over the natives more effectively, right? So they were like, okay, well, we need to find their native law texts, especially, and so we can kind of maintain peace and govern more effectively. But there was the immense benefit too, right? It's because they started translating these philosophical and spiritual texts, and those texts made it over to America. And you started having scholars of comparative religion, especially like Unitarians, right? Unitarians, very much like a philosophical denomination, a more philosophically inclined denomination of Christianity. They really took to these Hindu spiritual texts, and there was a lot of work done by these scholars to kind of disseminate the ideas of Hindu spirituality especially among like the elite of New England. And you see this develop. We don't have to go in depth treatment, but I'm sure listeners have heard of like the Transcendentalists, New Thought, like there was a whole host of spiritual movements in the 19th century America and 20th century America that kind of were heavily influenced by Hindu spirituality. So this is a kind of a long-winded way of saying that I split all the newspaper clips I see. I think broadly fit into these three different threads. And I think the interesting thing about Hindu history, and I think where the kind of real gems in terms of like what you can discern about American society comes from seeing how these threads interact, right? Because sometimes they're developing in parallel, sometimes they conflict, and sometimes they intertwine. And that's been a really interesting thing to see, just following the newspaper clips year by year, is seeing how these different threads kind of intertwine and interact.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.